Hey class, we're going to continue on with chapter 7, which is all about the nervous system. The last lesson we focused on our central nervous system, which is composed of two major organs, our brain and our spinal cord. We focused the entire last lesson talking about the brain. The brain gets a lot of the credit because we talked about how it processes, interprets, and delivers messages to the different parts of the body. There are four main parts of the brain: your cerebral hemisphere, your diencephalon, your cerebellum, and your brainstem. We did talk heavily and focused mainly on your cerebral hemisphere, how it looks, its different structures that are located on it, such as our somatic sensory area or our motor area, or how our ridges and gyri and sulci are named. Today, we are going to focus on our other three structures, which is your diencephalon, your cerebellum, and your brainstem. Let's focus on our diencephalon first. Sometimes you might hear people refer to this as the interbrain. It actually sits on top of the brainstem, and it's enclosed by your cerebral hemispheres, which means if you're just looking at a whole brain, the structure you're not able to see. It is made up of three structures: your thalamus, your hypothalamus, and your epithalamus. So to bring that picture back up, here is your diencephalon in purple. It sits right on top of that brainstem. And again, it looks a little faded because it's enclosed by your cerebrum, or otherwise your cerebral hemisphere. We also talked about how it's made up of three parts. The first part is going to be your thalamus. And if you follow the arrow, it's pointing to this darker purple here. Then it's made up of your hypothalamus, which makes up the floor of your diencephalon. And notice that it has a pretty big area. It's like a bluish purple. And then the last part is your pineal gland, which is part of your epithalamus. This is the part that's actually the third part. And it's right here, over here on this light purple. So let's talk about those three parts that I just pointed out. Your thalamus. Your thalamus is actually the relay station for any sensory impulses that you receive, such as the touch of something being cold, if you feel pain, maybe you feel pressure on your skin, and this passes up to your cerebral hemisphere, specifically the cortex part of it. The whole important part of this, and the reason that sensory impulses go through this, is because the thalamus actually helps transfer these impulses to the correct part of your cerebrum in order for it to interpret that information. So here's a picture that illustrates a sensory information coming up through your brainstem until it hits your thalamus. And from there, the thalamus sends it to the part of the brain that needs to interpret that information. Next, we have the hypothalamus, and this actually does a lot of important things. One, the location is it makes up the floor of that diencephalon that I pointed out. Now, one of the important functions of this is that it's important for autonomic nervous system regulation. Autonomic nervous system regulation are things that you do involuntary or automatically. Things like regulating your body temperature so you stay in homeostasis, or your water balance. And then it also helps regulate metabolism, which, if you remember what metabolism is, it's all the chemical reactions that happen in your body. Now, we're also going to talk about the hypothalamus because there's a lot of important structures that are located in this area as well. And one of those structures is something called the limbic center. The limbic center is very important for emotions because it controls things like, are we thirsty? Are we hungry? Our sex drive, our pain, our feelings, and then our pleasure centers. It also houses an important gland called the pituitary gland. Now, this is part of the endocrine system, but the hypothalamus helps regulate it. The pituitary gland's function is to create hormones to control our metabolism, our growth, our sexual maturation, our reproduction, and even our blood pressure. Another important structure in this area is the mammillary bodies, and these have reflex centers involved for olfaction, or other words known as smell. So here's this picture brought back up. Again, it shows your thalamus, but we also talked about your epithalamus. So the important structures here that we talked about was the pituitary gland, located right here. Your mammillary bodies located right here. So those are two very important structures that we see here. The last one that we're going to talk about that's part of your diencephalon is your epithalamus. This houses another important gland besides your pituitary. The epithalamus actually houses something called the pineal gland. This is an endocrine gland, and the whole point of this gland is to secrete melatonin. And melatonin actually regulates your light-dark cycles. For example, if the room is dark, you tend to release more melatonin to make you sleepy. The other important thing in this area is it includes something called the choroid plexus. The choroid plexus is knots of capillaries or blood vessels, in case you didn't know what capillaries were. And these blood vessels are in charge of making something known as cerebral spinal fluid. This is fluid located in your spinal cord and brain to help protect it. So if we're looking up here, your epithalamus, here is your pineal gland, and then your choroid plexus, which is part of your epithalamus as well, runs along down here as well. So that's the end of your diencephalon. Next, we're going to move on to your brain stem. Now, your brain stem attaches to your spinal cord, and it's characterized as being about the size of a thumb in diameter and about 3 inches long. The function of the brainstem is to provide pathways for ascending, which means to the brain, and then descending, or away from the brain. This area of your brain is actually associated with a lot of your cranial nerves, which are nerves that exit your head and neck region. It controls a lot of different activities such as breathing and blood pressure. There are 3 parts to the brainstem: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, or I call it the medulla oblongata. Here is our picture of our brainstem. There are 3 different parts. We have our midbrain, which makes up a big region over here. We also have our pons and then our medulla oblongata. First, let's focus on our midbrain. Our midbrain extends from the mammillary bodies to the pons inferiorly. So if we look at where our midbrain is showing, here's our mammillary body. So notice that extends from all the way from this region all the way down to below our pons inferiorly. So it's going to be located down here. So this region right here. This area has anteriorly, it has 2 bulging fiber tracts called cerebral peduncles. And the whole point of this is to convey those ascending and descending impulses that we are receiving. Now, dorsally located, which means behind or posteriorly, there are 4 rounded protrusions called the corpora quadrigemina, and these are for visual and auditory reflexes. Or in other words, visual is your sight and auditory is your hearing. So if we're looking up at your midbrain, your corpora quadrigemina posteriorly is located right here. And then your cerebral peduncle, which we said was anterior, is located right here in front. Next, we're going to talk about your pons. These are rounded structure protruding just below your midbrain, and it's mostly composed of fiber tracts, but the whole point that I want you to know for pons is it includes nuclei, or basically a bunch of cell bodies that help control breathing. This is the important part about the pons. So if I was going to show you a picture of the pons, it is right here jutting out. And the last one that we're going to talk about, I'm going to show you the picture now, is your medulla oblongata. It's located inferior to your pons region. Okay, so it's the inferior part of your brainstem, and it actually merges. This is the part that merges into your spinal cord. It includes important fiber tracts, and what I mean by fiber tracts is it's actually where motor fibers cross over to the opposite side. Remember, we talked about how the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body, and this is where that crossover happens. This area is also very important for heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, swallowing, and vomiting. And so a lot of these are overlapping functions. The one that helps me distinguish is swallowing and vomiting. Now, there is an area of the brainstem that we're going to talk about, but it's not one of the three main regions. And this area of the brainstem is called the reticular formation. We mention it because it has an important function for our body. This is defined as a mass of gray matter that is along the brainstem, which is why we're talking about it in this area of our notes. And it's involved in a lot of motor control of visceral organs. So remember, visceral organs are things like our digestive tract. Good example of that is our smooth muscle that moves things through our digestive tract. This is also the region where we find the reticular activating system, known as RAS. This plays a role in our wake-sleep cycles and our consciousness. And what I mean by consciousness is it means this area filters our incoming information and filters out any signals that are too weak or repetitive. So if you're able to tune out things, only strong impulses are able to come through. So here is an important image of your RAS system. So here it says your reticular formation is located along the outside. So here it's in purple. It extends along the entire brainstem and does help filter out those signals. So some of them don't always make it. The last part of our brain, so we've talked about the diencephalon and we talked about the brainstem. The last one we're talking about is your cerebellum. Your cerebellum is not divided into any regions, so here we just have this one structure. It's defined and classified and described as two hemispheres of convoluted surfaces that projects dorsally. So remember, dorsally means behind or posteriorly from the occipital lobe of your cerebrum. So remember, your occipital is the back of your head. If we're going to bring up a picture of it, your cerebellum is this structure right here. Again, it's located at the very back, right below the occipital. The whole point of your cerebellum is to control balance. It provides precise timing for your skeletal muscles, and this allows coordination between your body movements. If you drink alcohol, it actually affects this region of your brain the most because it actually makes your skeletal muscle and your coordination not as coordinated. So you tend to stumble or slur your words when you drink alcohol. And then this area of your brain must work with fibers connecting to the inner ear, your eye, and the proprioceptors in your skeletal muscles in order to make sure it creates equilibrium and balance. So you must use your ears, eyes, and skeletal muscles to maintain this balance. These all work very closely. And that's the end of today's lesson. If you have any questions, please make sure you ask. And otherwise I hope you guys have a great day.